Before we get into the next reading in the Doctrine and Covenants, let us discuss a little bit of the history. Remember, it was in June of 1834 that Zion's camp disbands, and a number of the men return to Kirtland, some stay in Missouri. Just prior to this disbanding was the section 105, in which God tells them to return to Kirtland and wait to be endowed with power from on high. Now our next section, being 106, isn't received until November of 1834. That is 5 months later. Now before I get into the history here, I do want to note that my Zion's Camp video is taking a little bit longer. I will be releasing it very shortly, but I am going to do this video and my reading of section 106 before I do the Zion's Camp video. The reason for this is that the final aftermath, Zion's Camp itself was in May and June of 1834, but the final aftermath of Zion's Camp comes around in February of 1835 with the calling of the 12 Apostles. So we're going to do this, then we will do Zion's Camp, which will conclude with that event. So let us get into our history. During these 5 months, we have three main things that I want to touch on briefly. First, there is the organizing of a high council in Zion, according to the same pattern as was given in section 102 and the organization made in Kirtland. For this, David Whitmer is president. Now, the high council in Zion performs many items of business over the summer. The most important one being, first of all, is, preach to the people, gather and organize the saints in the Clay County and surrounding areas outside of Jackson. But then also there's a couple of accusations made, and people are brought in a hearing before the council. One minor one was, I can't remember who it was, but he had been teaching that all disease is caused by Satan, and that anybody who visits a doctor is being evil because the saints are to live by faith. This was brought to the high council, and the high council made two decisions. First, keep your private beliefs private. You want to believe that all disease is from Satan? Fine, just don't teach it. But teaching that it was evil to go to the doctor was directly condemned, because in a previous revelation, God had commanded us, if you don't have the faith to be healed, it's fine, go see a doctor. And so that was declared by the high council as directly contrary to God's word. But if you want to believe that all disease comes from the devil, fine, just don't preach it as gospel doctrine. And we get this kind of beginning where a separation of personal belief and church doctrine. We see this here. But the more important one is the Hewlett branch. Now, the Hewlett branch was one of the branches in Jackson County that was driven out by the mob. At this time, there is an accusation brought against the branch as a whole, most specifically against Brother Hewlett himself and a Sister Crandall. Now, Brother Hewlett, he would be speaking in tongues, and Sister Crandall would interpret for him. And they claimed that this gift superseded the prophet, that God had given them this special privilege of receiving revelation through tongues, and that even Joseph Smith would have to prove himself by them receiving a revelation through this gift of tongues before they would accept anything from Joseph Smith. They would reject everything from anybody else unless Brother Hewlett received a revelation through this gift of tongues that was then translated by Sister Crandall. Sister Crandall also professed this gift of seeing into men's hearts, which seemed very weird because she was seeing like books in men's hearts. So one guy, he saw three young girls in his heart. Just very weird stuff. So the high council took this into consideration, whereas this was not a good spirit. This was the devil deceiving the Hewlett branch. And so they sent several elders in to preach to them, to straighten them out. And they did express to the high council a willingness to be reasoned with and shown their error. And so these elders went out, they talked to them, they reasoned with them, they showed them where their errors were, and eventually they all confessed that it was a false spirit that had been among them. The important thing to note here is that this false spirit had started while they were in Jackson County, which gives us some indication as to why or what was going on that prompted the Lord to allow them to be driven out. They were giving heed to false spirits. Some of them were, not all of them, but some of them were giving heed to these false spirits. in addition to the arrogance, the pride, and the greed that was shown in kind of a general manner. Now that's the Hewlett branch. Now let's move to Kirtland for our next important historical event. And that was shortly after getting back to Kirtland. Joseph Smith, he leaves in July, and he gets back to Kirtland in late August, I believe, and I think he got back early August, because I think it's August 11th. There's a bishop's hearing, and they actually appear before the High Council. Sylvester Smith, who was the chief complainer on Zion's camp, he just complained about everything. And he was one of those that really got mad that they didn't get to fight the mobs in Missouri. So now that Joseph Smith is back in Kirtland, he brings an accusation against Joseph Smith. And we have the only time in church history that the president of the church was brought up on charges before the High Council. It has never happened since, but Joseph Smith stood before the High Council and was tried according to the laws of the High Council. Now in this case, again, I can't remember who the president was, because Joseph Smith is normally the president of this High Council, but he's the one being accused. Unanimous, the council completely exonerates Joseph Smith, and they censure Sylvester for his contentions. Now, he says he's not going to listen to the High Council, and he says this publicly over the next several days, and later on in August, he is brought before the High Council on his own hearing for not abiding by the ruling of the High Council. And he is questioned, everything is laid bare, we get it all sorted out, and eventually Sylvester Smith does repent. And he comes back into full fellowship with the church, and he is actually, eventually, in February of 1835, he is called as one of the presidents of the First Quorum of the 70. I find this whole event, this shows us that at this time the church is growing, they're still learning, they still don't fully understand that the prophet, the president, is God's anointed, and God will justify. But they don't fully understand, well, at least not all of them fully understand this, and Joseph Smith, willing to teach them, willing to let them learn and progress at their own pace, you might say, he willingly submits to this trial. As I said, never happened again, but we see the church is still in its infancy. This has only been, 4.5 years since it was organized, and they're still figuring things out. We still have a development of church organization, church authority. The High Council has only been created less than 6 months earlier. So there is a lot of stuff that people are trying to figure out. And though Joseph Smith understands, he also understands that people need to come to the truth on their own. You can't force them into the truth. Joseph Smith had the authority. He could just say, no, I'm not doing this. I'm the prophet. I am the president. But if he had, I think it would have caused greater tension in the church, and probably would have caused a greater rift in the church at the time. And with all the mob violence in Missouri, and even persecution going on in Kirtland, they needed the church to be united. And so Joseph Smith willingly submits, because he knows that if he doesn't, things are going to be a lot worse. Now he does say that after this, the church enters a kind of period of peace. And they do from 34 to about late 36, early 37. There isn't too much persecution. There's still some tensions, but the persecution dies down to a significant extent, both in Missouri and in Kirtland. And so we have this time of peace starting. And that brings us to our third event, in that once all this controversy is settled with Sylvester, Joseph Smith, starting in October, goes straight into building the temple. And the building process, it progresses rapidly. And he is expending most of his time in overseeing the quarry and doing the work himself. He says whenever he can, he does whatever work he's able to do himself. But he has other things he has to do at this time. But he's overseeing the work. That's his primary focus. We are now going to build the temple because God told us two reasons why you couldn't redeem Zion is because you're not living a Zion life. You don't have a Zion community, but also you don't have the power. You need to be endowed by God, and that endowment can't come until we build the temple. And so Joseph Smith goes to work on the temple. Now he does take a few days to travel up to Michigan and teach the saints up there. That's one other thing I do want to mention at this time, is that a lot of people, when we look at church history, and I'm guilty of this myself, we have Kirtland and we have Missouri. And we get the idea that whenever somebody was converted, they either moved to Kirtland or to Missouri. And the saints just congregated in these two places. But that is not what was happening. Rather, we had the main centers, and a lot of saints were gathering to these two places, but there were a lot of branches organized throughout the United States. Michigan had its own kind of small center of church membership up there. There were members still living in New York. There were branches out in New York. There were branches as far as Maine in the Northeast, and I believe down south you had branches in the Carolinas in that area. And then you had several branches in Indiana, in Illinois. For Zion's Camp, they left Kirtland with only 100 men, or a little over 100. I think Joseph Smith said they had 130. By the time they got to Missouri, they had a little over 200, because men kept joining them from the congregations that they would pass through. And Michigan sent a number of men itself down to join them. So we have the spreading out of the church. The church was never just in one centralized location. You had the center, and then you had the branches. And at this time, Joseph is focused on building the temple, but he does make a couple of trips to visit the branches. And that's what's going on between sections 105 and 106. So I'm going to leave this here, and we return to our reading in section 106.